To introduce our first presenter, Samuel Kamuela Plunkett. He'll be taking his County of Hawaii planner hat off for this meeting and joining us today as a UH anthropology student, I believe. Are you a student or are you an instructor?
No, I'm a graduate and Powhatan School.
Awesome. So he'll be joining us to share his dissertation on Waimea's heritage landscape using GIS to communicate change and significance of a cultural landscape in South Kohala, Hawaii. His abstract states Hawaii County's land use pattern allocation guideline map shows an increase in lands being allocated for urban development in the South Kohala district of Hawaii Island, being that land allocations and subsequent zoning is created by a combination of Hawaii state land use designations and the Hawaii County General Plan. This thesis addresses preservation and restoration of a region's natural and cultural resources and sense of place from a planning approach in order to incorporate both cultural and environmental resources into an integrated plan that also accounts for community input. I combine a cultural landscape approach with geographic information systems, GIS, to produce a heritage landscape resource inventory model. Aloha and welcome, Kamuela.
Aloha, thanks, Janice. I have a presentation for you folks, so I don't know if you're able to share the host with me.
You have access, I believe, to share.
Okay, are we good? Everybody sees that?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So, thanks for that introduction, Janice, and I just thank everybody for this time to share. And I'm gonna try and blitz through, but really quick. So I'm a local boy. I grew up in Waimea and then also sometime in Mountain View. I'm a graduate from Waiakea High School in '96, and then I moved to Oahu, worked in the construction industry, building homes for many years until I just noticed that our islands was changing a lot, and I wanted to be a part of the conversation. So I went back to school, so I went to school to study Polynesian migration, traditional food production strategies, and archaeology and anthropology. And throughout that whole time, I just noticed that communities and development was always butting heads. And I was constantly thinking about, is there a better way to communicate proactively before developments are proposed, so that both developers and community is having a discussion way before ground is being broken. So this is not the answer, but I think this is an approach to build upon. And so I'm just going to share what I came up with for my my thesis. And so today I adjusted and I edited out a lot of information, but I'm going to talk about reforming and reconciling our land use practices, bridging Ike Kupuna and modern day land use planning. And even though this thesis was focused on the South Kohala district, just realize that the model or the approach to derive community-based and culturally based land use designations can be applied to any other district on the island. So here we go. This picture right here to the left is that's the ancient Alaloa Trail next to Kekailani private resort condominiums. And I just use this picture because, believe it or not, we've always been negotiating between old and the new and how we do that. And this is somebody's conception of a negotiation of what's proper. Is that right or wrong? I'm not going to judge, but I like this picture for addressing that. So quick overview of land use structure in Hawaii. From the state land use law level, we're coming in at HRS 205. David Calley's comments, Hawaii was the first state in the United States in 1961 to introduce a land use law. So it seemed really innovative, but according to David Calley's economic professor at the University of Manoa, he says, even though it sounded innovating, we have to realize that from the very beginning, the land use law was favoring these the big five, which is the power holders. Anyway, I'm not gonna go to, I kind of get stuck in any one place, so sorry if I don't elaborate. I'm just gonna dump a lot of stuff on you guys, and I'll give you my email if you guys wanna talk about anything after. So that's at the state level, and state land use is part of the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. Coming down to the county level, of course, we have the general plan and the county zoning code that guides our land use. So when I was going through this, I thought about how do we come up with the land use pattern? What is the method that we do? So if you read through the general plan, and mind you, the general plan is being updated, and there may be some changes to it, but this was back when I was first starting my research. But if you read through this, through the methodology, you'll notice that it doesn't talk about biocultural sustainability and other metrics, right? So even though we're coming up with sustainable plans, the 30 by 30 state plan, the 2050 state plan, and all of these plans mention taking care of our cultural and natural resources. But if you actually look at the methodology, it's not really mentioned in there. And there's a default perception that if we don't know what the land is good for, let's just make it urban. So also lacking in that land use process is community knowledge. And I guess throughout my lifetime, I've seen this clash between development and community voice. But I say community knowledge because it's not just about community voice, it's about community knowledge. And how is there a process to get both of those into how we designate land use? So as you can see, many communities have been negotiating this for most of our lifetimes. Keep the Country first started out on the North Shore of Oahu. We have Kona making the same plead. In 2009, the Laie community asked the question, what does keep the country mean? And that's a hard question to answer. People are so passionate about it from the communities. But when you have 3 minutes to tell a commission why it's important, that's hard to do. So the community needs better tools. Yeah. So when I talk about reform land use, some of the objectives were to increase community knowledge in land use designating, better integrate natural and cultural resource management into the actual land use designations. So here's a thought. What if our zoning code actually helped us to restore how much native vegetation is in a certain area? I think we think about the zoning code in a one dimension, but actually it could do much more if it had the right EK in it. Okay, moving on. Other goals is to provide communities methods to better articulate sense of place, and to help communities plan for resilience and equity. So this model is trying to incorporate all these things on the right. Don't get caught up on heritage landscape resource inventory model. It is the model I created, but the name, it can be shifted to whatever community wants to, whichever community, what they want to call it, they can call it that. But the basic tenets of this cultural landscape model is to know that the Ahupua'a system was actually based on a moku watershed system. Everybody knows like ahupa'a was good for sustainability, but actually it didn't work unless it was accounting for the district level watershed system. So we got to think our land use policies got to be broader, because the actual environment and how our kupuna divided up the lands, the reason why it was sustainable was because they divided up in big enough systems that allowed the natural processes to sustain itself, basically. Moku scale resource management was an embedded strategy into traditional land division boundaries. The protection of your watersheds actually benefits every VAL or environmental climate zone from Mauka to Makai. And then there's these sections of lands that were common gathering areas that was protected by ideals like Ba'okua, and trails that intersected these resource zones actually increased equity and resilience in traditional times. And the last point is that when you divide up the lands through TMK parceling and zoning that isn't informed by these tenants, you're actually, over the years, you're losing more and more of environmental resilience, which actually leads to social lowering. Society itself is actually less resilient. Okay, I gotta move on, sorry. So the process for community engagement is one to help the community define spatially their natural resources, cultural resources, their agricultural assets, and you can even map Mo'olelo and other segments of history. Of course, Waimea had ranching, but it also had this military era. There's nothing wrong with mapping these eras, and then also recording place names. So you map all of those. What else is needed is a new metric for defining what is significant or not. After you get it mapped and you develop your metric, you then are able to develop these statements that are geospatially referenceable with evidence, either in academia or on the ground. It still exists. And from that, derive your land use guidelines. And this image to the right is just this process of community actually doing the work, creating this spatial model that at the very bottom serves as a bridge between community-based land use program and the government. So in my schooling, I was a part of 4 different field schools, and these were archaeological field schools. But again, it's not just about cultural resources, it's about natural resources, but we've seen how we can partner with communities to increase their capacity to be able to create something that can speak to government. Okay, so now I'm gonna get into it. So I'm just gonna go over 5 basic layers. I wanna do a time check. Kakia, you know how much time I got left?
It's 2:01. So I think you've got another 30 minutes. We are good.
Okay. So all of those, that process that I mentioned in the beginning, I'm breaking it down into 5 layers that for me, with the time given for my research, that I could break down, that you could actually get meaningful results. So first of all, you wanna begin with what is the correct perception of place. And that's gonna be informed by the traditional boundaries. So growing up in Waimea and seeing the changes happening so fast, when people talk about preserving Waimea, well, what is the actual boundaries of Waimea? And you know what, nobody knew, so I had to go back in the Mahele records. And when I look at all of these different ahupua'a and ili, which is a smaller division of land than the ahupua'a, the Mahele records actually state that these are lands of Waimea, Kalana. Kalana is similar to a district scale land division. But anyway, so even down at the coast at Waikoloa, at Anaiho'omalu, the Mahela records state that that land actually belongs to Waimea. So when I spatially mapped out which lands are referenced as Waimea, you get a much different picture than a small town. Yeah, and for South Kohala, everything except Kauai, the two Kauai Ahupua'a are considered Waimea. And but for my purposes, I just talk about South Kohala and Waimea Kalana interchangeably. So if you look at the landmass, now this small little portion down here, that's what the federal government calls a census designated place. Yeah, and so it does define Waimea town, but traditionally it's not picking up what the biocultural sustainable land use strategy is. So just quick breakdown of what I mentioned. Your kalana, in terms of talking about land divisions, is similar to some accounts as a moku or moku aina, which is your district level. Yeah, so all of these lands, all of these ili over here, they all say that they belong to Waimea, as well as Pu'ukapu, Waikoloa, and Lalamilo. Okay, second layer of this model is really grasping the landscape and the view sheds, because when it comes to sense of place, how the community associates with its place, a lot has to do with names and your visual resources. I show this map because you see there's many trails running throughout this Kalana, and even these roads, government roads of the historic times, they actually began as historic trails. So Holly McIndowney writes, although few of the resources themselves appear to have had a limited distribution, their use tended to be clustered or localized in specific areas and linked by major or subsidiary trails. Now trails, I'll get into why trails are significant, but people used to think that ahupua'a were hard and fast boundaries that the maka'ainana couldn't cross over. But actually, if the trails are going laterally into other, so I just want to dispel, not that it's not true, but there was resource sharing across ahupua'a boundary lines, which increased the overall resiliency of the district. Visually, what I found interesting for Waimea is that, as you folks know, you drive through Waimea, there's all these hills. But many of these hills are actually corresponding to boundary points of the district. So here's a trail that I overlaid from one of the historic maps, going right through the plain ascending South Kohala. So think about when you're going Mauka Makai and you're thinking about the boundaries of the Ahupua'a in your district. It's all encompassing. So sense of place, right? A lot has to do with place names and land divisions. So here's just an illustration looking for somebody walking up through the plain, that the kupuna knew exactly where they were, who they had to talk to, or who they had to give makana to as they traversed up and down. And this is huge sense of place. It's just another perspective of what you can see from the plain. And here are some photos. Yeah, so just by referencing place names and points on the ground, you know where you are, you know what your social place is, your social status is, and who you gotta make sure you're pono with before you go. So even though there's access across Ahupua'a, you still gotta know where you're going, and who you got to talk to. Okay, the next layer is recreating what the vegetation pattern was. I got this from Holly McIndoney, who recreated what the vegetation was right around 1850. So right before cattle really started to decimate the native veg. And there was also recorded land use practices from Mahela records and also historic accounts from early visitors to the islands. So she designated these land zones, and she mentioned, again, from those resources that I mentioned, how the land was being used in those areas. Yeah. Ulula'au literally means, well, not literally, but it's similar to our term agroforestry. And Waimea town is most of Ulula'au. Anyway, I gotta keep moving. So each one of these land zones has vegetation and recorded land use practices. So let's put that back into the minds of, one, the community, but then also our land use planning decisions. I just want you to notice that Pu'ukapu today looks almost all pasture, but actually the land division of Pu'ukapu was mostly forest. And then over here where you get close to Mauna Kea, we got to imagine that there was also a mamane forest going around Mauna Kea. So actually all of Pu'ukapu was forested at one time. Now, why does that matter? Because Pu'ukapu actually served as the watershed, the absorbing the moisture from the atmosphere, either by rain or mist, and actually served as the catchment for much. This section over here is coming from Mauna Loa, but most of this is coming from Pu'ukapu. Isn't it interesting that the land division matches where the watershed is? And this is actually one of the resource commons that serve the rest of the district. So again, when we talk about preserving Waimea, what are we actually talking about? There's another angle of Pu'ukapu and the different forested zones in Pu'ukapu in relation to the coastline. This layer is showing the aquifers in relation to the same resources. So why is it important, and how does equity fill into this? Lorenzo Lyons talks about the commons and that he believed that the moku was really expressing what the commons were. And he talks about these, on the inner portions of the districts are these land large divisions that everybody had right to access. But that equity also comes down on the coastline as well. So if you look within the district, only one stream actually would make it all the way down to the coast. And that's over here by Mauna Kea Beach Hotel, O'Uli Stream, which comes out as Wai'ulaula. I think Ponokoa also would come out. So these areas are getting water throughout most of their ahupua'a. And over here, the drier ones, even though they didn't have streams, the underground water from the catchment above is feeding these fish ponds. So all of a sudden, your watershed is spreading equity across the entire moku. Yeah, so Lily Kala writes, when one studies fish ponds and how they were connected by underground waterways, it seems likely that the larger moku districts were subterranean water management areas. That's why it's so important that for the future, that we get back to this system. Okay, next layer is traditional agriculture. So through archaeological research, finding, not done by me, but by others, and just taking the research on traditional agriculture, the remnants of it, and mapping it. What we find is, here's a map from a 1983 study, Field Complex 1, 2, which is right by the dump. You can actually still see some of the field walls. This was a huge one, Field Complex 3 and Field Complex 4. In 1914, there was a water dispute between Parker Ranch and the state. And they commissioned Walter E. Wall to do a map of all the Hawaiʻi. And so all this you see in this map down here is Hawaiʻi running through Waimea town. So I overlaid the map. I pinpointed a point off of Waikoloa stream that I thought was a source of one of the Hawaiʻi. And then sure enough, it actually comes out right at this point. So Akona Hawaiʻi comes out by the nature park. And today this looks like a trail, but it actually was in Hawaiʻi. And it was feeding an irrigated system of more than 3,000 acres. Yeah, so accounting for what archaeologically is recorded in the field complexes and that Ulula'au agroforestry region in the uplands of Waimea, there was over close to 9,500 acres of traditional ag going on. 4,000 of those acres was irrigated. So most of Waimea town that you can't see today was irrigated. Okay, so take all of this information, and I told you the important part is the metric that you use. So what I did is, the metric that I used was to take the different layers of the mapping program and then run them against Hawaiian resource management practices, UNESCO criteria for cultural landscapes, which accounts for both cultural and natural resources, what their traditional or natural function is, and your baseline perception, meaning like, how does this resource affect your association to place? And I run it through this metric. I just fill out the metric, and then what you get is statements of significance. And I'm not going to read it to you, but it's really interesting because this statement of significance is place-based. It's all evidence on the ground. Then after you have those statements of significance, then you start to draw these lines of land use designation. Now, in this age that we are in, I don't see us ever getting at this point in time where this is going to be adopted by the county. But in the intermediate, I see this as a possible approach to create a map that both governmental planners and developers can look. So when they're coming in for an application for a certain TMK, they can see where their project is in relation to these values that are on the ground. And this is an example of what a land use guideline based on all the previous information would sound like. And this is where you can actually start to regrow a forest. Imagine if the land use guideline said, if you're building in this area where there used to be a forest, the community has agreed that planting 5 poa and 5 ohia per acre is required. And how much trees would you get if you had that type of land use control? Okay, that was a lot of information. I'm just gonna end with this. The word konahiki is actually a compound word. Kono, to invite, and hiki, meaning possibilities. The basic function of the konahiki in traditional times was to invite possibilities onto the land. But you gotta remember that the konahiki was thinking about long-term production. If he made all kind of production and the next day there was famine because everything was depleted, I'm pretty sure his chief would, yeah, he would get it. Our modern day zoning and land use designations is a form of konahiki because it tells people what you can and cannot do on the land even before you buy it. This is a way of bringing back konahiki into our modern day land use practices. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Kamuela. That was really beautiful. It was so nice to break up the day with like culturally rooted information about her. I know we get so much in the weeds about other things. We got a comment from Lanakila too. following you. I see so many intersections between our environmental stream, our economic stream, work for food sustainability as well. I think it's really important to keep those things in mind, how connected they all are. Thank you. We're actually a bit early, so I just want to invite if there are questions for Kamuela to kind of unpack any details about the presentation.
I also want to say mahalo nui loa. This is excellent. And I'm interested in the amount of, it just seems monumental, the amount of work and research that you did for this one area, and what would it take as far as time or resources to expand this work across the entire island?
So if you imagine it's one college student, one graduate student putting 2.5 years of intensive research in, can do that, what I just did. Imagine if you had a community that was given the GIS tools, the research tools, and even you can GIS Mo'olelo. And not to diminish it, but you can GIS that thing and make that thing real on the ground again. That knowledge is still in some of our residents of place now. So I did that with 2.5 years, right? And like I said, the model is flexible to take to another district. To me, it has to be done at the district level to really secure the biocultural sustainability possibility of it. And to me, it's not a one-time deal that the community, nonprofit community-based program this would be an ongoing community of practice, basically, constantly updating their GIS inventory. But if every district was to do it for themselves, you would eventually get the whole island done in 10 years, 10 to 12 years. If they're doing it one at a time. If communities were doing this concurrently, you would have an alternate biocultural sustainability land use plan for the entire island. And every island in our Pai'aina, in our archipelago can do this.
I have a question. Yeah, Kamuela. So, you know, the Ahupuas all used to have resident houses, right? Of people and the places where people stayed and lived. Can your model be extended to identify appropriate locations for housing?
Yes. You know, I think again, this is where the archaeological and the ethnographic record comes into play, and where you can map out what the settlement pattern was, and that will inform. To be honest, there's some commonalities, right? Wherever you see ancient Hawaiian settlements, you're gonna find water, right? And it's not different from today. But one of the practices is that when you understand how important topography is to the watershed system, you want to think less about these projects that require deep grading. You want to go more with the contour of the landscape. And then another thing is, instead of going across, like laterally across the landscape, I think most of the settlement patterns, especially by the ravines and such, is you're gonna go up and down. I forget what his name was, but he was a student on Oahu, and he did this research called indigenous urbanization, And I had a little bit struggle with the title, but he really gets into a modern day settlement pattern that tries to honor the traditional wisdom. Anyway, sorry, I don't know if I answered it. I think I can provide you some resources. It's hard to talk about right now.
Well, yeah, actually, you could give us a reference to that last article you talked about. That might be of interest.
His name was Sean something. But I can look for the reference and shoot it to Janice or Kaikea, and then they can give it to you when I go home and find it.
I found an
Thank you.
article just Googling, so I'll pop that in for now.
I just want to take a moment to say mahalo, Kamuela. That was an awesome presentation. And I think that really fits in with not only the housing situation, but many other things. We're talking about addressing global warming and climate change, all stuff. This is exactly the types of conversations that need to be had. I was just curious too, I couldn't quite make out, but would you say like Kuhio Village, Hawaiian Homes area, is that Pu'ukapu?
Yeah. Puyo Village is still in Pu'ukapu. Yes.
Okay. And just an opening up, I don't know if you're familiar with Aina Aloha Economic Futures Initiative. That's another initiative that was launched last year, trying to encourage more environmental and cultural based support and language. I actually am one of the original authors of that, and just maybe we connect after this. I'd love if maybe we can do a presentation for us on that.
Oh yeah, mahalo. And I would like to read up on what you guys are doing. Yeah, thank you.
Let's connect. Mahalo.
Any other questions?